The night smelled of smoke and surrender. Under the beam of a jeep's headlight, a line of Japanese women stood barefoot in the mud. Soldiers in torn uniforms, medics with blood beneath their nails, clerks and radio operators whose war had finally ended. Their swords, once symbols of honor, lay in a pile like broken bones. American guards did not scream at them, did not strike them, did not parade them in chains. Instead, they handed the women something far more humiliating. Books, not orders, not punishments. Books filled with strange words like rights, elections, and freedom of speech. Some of the women spat in the dirt. Others trembled with confused rage. Because for warriors raised to die with honor, nothing cut deeper than this quiet defeat. Rain hammered the corrugated rooftops of the temporary American detention camp in Luzon. The war in the Pacific was in its final breaths, but no one knew how many breaths remained. The days were filled with rifle cracks in the jungle, night ambushes, and the shadows of aircraft crossing the moon. Yet here, inside coils of barbed wire, the war took on a different shape, quieter but cruel in its own way. The first female Japanese prisoners arrived before dawn. American Marines expected spies, assassins, even suicide attackers. What they saw instead were exhausted women half carrying, half dragging their wounded, nurses from the 44th Field Hospital Unit, clerks from artillery commands, radio operators from shattered divisions, and a handful of actual combat soldiers, women who had fired rifles in the final defense of Manila. Some were barely 20. Others were old enough to have children serving the emperor. They stepped into camp wearing muddy uniforms, eyes hollow, skin bruised from days without sleep. One carried a torn flag folded against her chest as if holding the corpse of a nation. Another limped on a bandaged leg, refusing help even when she collapsed into the mud. The American guards had been told these women would rather die than surrender. But it wasn't death they feared now, it was humiliation. Surrender was a dishonor deeper than the grave. Major Edward M. Vance, commander of the detention unit, watched from the doorway of the administration hut. A veteran of Guadalcanal and Palilu, he knew hatred like other men knew breathing. Yet as he watched the women stumble under the weight of their pride and their wounds, he felt something else, responsibility. The prisoners were escorted to the barracks, bamboo walls, tin roofs, plank floors still wet from the monsoon. Before they entered, American medics checked them for weapons. Hidden knives, sewing needles filed into points, even one small grenade removed from a nurse's boot. The nurses showed no fear. Their eyes were cold mirrors reflecting nothing. Inside the barracks, the women sat on floor mats, refusing water, refusing to speak. When an American corporal offered a canteen, one prisoner slapped it from his hand. She hissed a single word, "Bakemono." Monster. The Americans didn't argue. They just kept working. By mid-morning, the interpreter arrived, Sergeant Thomas Ito, Japanese-American, born in California. Now serving the country many of these women believed was made of cowards. He stood before them, voice firm but calm. "You are prisoners of war. You will not be harmed. You will receive food, water, and medical care, but you will follow camp rules." The women stared at him with venom, a traitor to his blood, a man they would have shot without hesitation days earlier. But they listened. Then came the orders they did not expect. Each prisoner was issued a pamphlet printed in Japanese. A simple document stamped with the seal of the U.S. Office of War Information. Sergeant Ito handed them out one by one, placing the papers gently onto mats. The women looked down. The bold headline read, "Minjujuyi no Genzok, the Principles of Democracy." At first there was silence. Then laughter, harsh, bitter, shaking with disbelief. They tore the pamphlets, spat on them. One woman used hers to wipe blood from her lip. Their sense of honor had survived hunger, wounds, even surrender. But this? Teaching them how Americans believed a society should function? It was an insult carved into the bone. Major Vance watched from the doorway. He didn't smile, didn't scowl. He simply waited for the rage to burn itself out. When the pamphlets lay scattered in damp shreds, he spoke quietly. "Collect them again," he ordered his men. "Give them back, every day if we must." The next morning, the women awoke to find the torn pamphlets gone, and new ones placed neatly at the foot of their mats. This time, some of the women did not tear them. They stared, eyes narrowed, lips tight. The pamphlets spoke of elections, of free speech, of leaders chosen by the people, not born to power, of rights no emperor could suspend. For women raised under imperial obedience, the words were sharper than knives. Nurse Sakura Nagamine, once a proud lieutenant in the Imperial Medical Corps, held the paper beneath the lantern's glow. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from fury. She whispered to the women beside her, "They want to turn us into Americans." But that wasn't the truth. Major Vance had no desire to change their blood or their loyalty. He wanted something else, something Japan had never taught its soldiers: choice. Many prisoners, male and female alike, had no idea what peace meant. They knew surrender was shame. Serving the emperor was duty. Dying in combat was honor. But peace? Peace was a word without meaning. The Americans began daily instruction. Sergeant Ito stood before the group, chalk in hand, writing characters onto a board scavenged from a ruined schoolhouse. ZU, Freedom Quan Li, Rights Fa, Law Xuanju. Elections. Every lesson felt like a wound. The women sat rigid, refusing to answer questions, refusing to raise their eyes, but they listened. Even silence could not stop the words from sinking in. At meals, the Americans placed books on the tables. Children's civics books, newspapers, even comic strips about elections and town hall debates. The women ignored them at first until one soldier, Private Kimiko Abe, stared too long at a cartoon showing a woman voting. She quickly looked away, ashamed of her curiosity. The camp routine became a ritual of defiance. Americans taught. Prisoners resisted. Americans repeated. Prisoners scowled. And yet every night a few more pamphlets disappeared into pockets instead of trash bins. But not every woman accepted this silent invasion of ideas. One evening, after roll call, a fight broke out in the barracks. A group of female soldiers surrounded a young clerk, accusing her of reading the pamphlet by lantern light. They dragged her into the courtyard, screaming, "Li Tierija!" Traitor. American guards intervened, breaking up the beating. The girl was carried to the infirmary, face swollen, ribs cracked. She begged them not to tell the others she had survived. That night, Major Vance made a decision. He ordered a small group of prisoners, nurses, clerks, and radio operators to attend a structured classroom session each morning. Attendance was mandatory. Anyone who refused would lose work duty privileges and rations for a day. The women were furious. But they came. Inside a bamboo-walled classroom, they sat cross-legged on mats. The air smelled of chalk dust and wet earth. The interpreter began teaching again, voice calm, words sharp. What is a government without the voice of its people? How does a democracy prevent tyranny? Why should citizens have rights? For women who had been taught only obedience, these questions were weapons, ideas more dangerous than rifles. Some wept silently, others stared into nothingness. But something changed. When Sergeant Ito asked a question on the 5th day, one prisoner answered. A quiet voice, barely more than a whisper, but it was an answer. The room went still. Some prisoners glared at her with hatred. Others stared with awe. The wall of silence, so carefully built, had cracked. On the 10th day, another woman answered. On the 12th, 3 more raised their hands. And on the 13th, a question rose from the prisoners themselves. Why can your women vote when ours cannot? It was not anger. It was confusion. A world unlearned, Sergeant Ito explained, slowly, carefully. The women listened not with contempt, but with hunger. A hunger they didn't yet understand. But pride dies slowly. Private Kimiko Abe stood and slammed her fist on the desk. Japan does not need American ideas. Japan needs victory. Her voice shook. Her eyes filled with tears, because she knew victory was gone. No one argued with her. They didn't need to. Outside, the night sky trembled with distant artillery. The empire was collapsing mile by mile, island by island. And inside the bamboo walls of a prison camp, captured women were learning a truth their emperor had never allowed them to hear. That there was another way to build a nation besides blood and obedience. Morning in the camp began with the metallic clang of a shovel striking a barrel, followed by the long roll of boots on wet earth. The prisoners stood for roll call in silence, their uniforms stiff with dried mud, hair tied back with strips of cloth torn from bandages. The lessons had not broken them, not yet. Their backs remained straight, eyes forward, jaws set like stone. Warriors by birthright, prisoners by fate, but something inside the wire had changed. On the 15th day, the Americans brought books, real books, stacked inside wooden crates hauled from Manila libraries. Leather-bound volumes, cracked spines, pages swollen from humidity. Shakespeare, Tolstoy, political primers, newspapers, histories of revolutions and republics. Some were written in Japanese, others in English with handwritten translations tucked between pages. Major Vance placed them on tables in the open courtyard, letting the women see them before anyone touched them. Nurses of the Imperial Army had memorized the medical code of Bushido: sacrifice, discipline, obedience. Clerks and typists had sworn oaths to the Emperor. Combat auxiliaries had trained to fight until the last bullet. Books were not tools of war. They were the weapons of peace, and for that they were terrifying. At first, no one approached. But the Americans were patient. Patience was a weapon too. When rain finally forced the prisoners indoors, the books were moved to the barracks, neatly stacked on a crude bamboo shelf. Their presence hovered like ghosts. Nights grew restless. Whispers replaced silence. Women lay awake, staring toward the shelf as if the books might move on their own. The first to break was the youngest, Private Yumi Takahashi, barely 18. Before the war, she had been a student in Kyoto, loved literature, dreamed of being a teacher. But the empire had needed soldiers, not scholars. She had traded ink for blood, textbooks for rifles. Late one night, while the others slept, Yumi crawled across the barrack floor and touched the spine of a book, the Constitution of the United States translated into Japanese. Her fingers trembled. She opened it. She had expected arrogance. Instead, she found simplicity, rules, limits, ideas written not for emperors but for people like her. Rights given not by gods or kings but by law. She read until a shadow fell across the page. Sakura Nagamine stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes like blades. "You shame yourself," Sakura said. Yumi bowed her head. "I only wish to understand our enemy." Sakura stepped forward, grabbed the book, and flung it across the room. "You are understanding nothing. We are Japanese. We do not learn from them." The other prisoners stirred, watching from their mats. Some nodded in agreement. Others stared at the book on the floor, its pages fluttering like wounded wings. At dawn, there were two changes no one expected. The book was back on the shelf, and Yumi was first in line for the democracy lesson. The classroom sessions grew larger by the day. What had begun as a forced obligation became, in the smallest and most fragile way, a curiosity. The women still sat stiff-backed, still scowled, still treated every word as an insult. But they listened. Sergeant Ito's teaching changed as well. He no longer lectured. He asked questions. And questions were far more dangerous than answers. What is loyalty? Is it obedience without thought? Or obedience with understanding? What is honor? Is it dying for a leader? Or living for your people? If a government demands sacrifice, must it not also protect those who sacrifice? The prisoners felt each question like a blow to the ribs. Japan had taught them to obey, but no one had taught them to think. One afternoon, during a lesson on constitutional law, a prisoner raised her hand. The room froze. It was Sakura. Her voice was cold iron. "You say citizens can oppose their leaders. If a man defies the emperor, is that not treason?" Ito answered quietly. "In a democracy, the people are the leaders." Sakura shook her head in disgust. "Then there is no honor, only chaos." But that night, long after lights out, Sakura sat alone beneath a lantern, flipping through a pamphlet she had once torn in half. She read every word. The Americans noticed the shift. Respect replaced suspicion. Guards began speaking to the prisoners as if they were equals, not enemies. They discussed food, weather, music. Some even traded words in Japanese for words in English, laughing at the mistakes. Not everyone laughed. Sergeant Harold McLean, a Marine whose brother had been killed on Saipan, could barely look at the prisoners without hatred twisting his jaw. To him, these women were not innocents. They were part of the machine that had slaughtered Americans across the Pacific. When he saw them reading books, being treated with dignity, rage boiled inside him. One evening, as prisoners filed into the mess tent for supper, McLean slammed his fist against a wooden post and shouted, "Why do we give them books? Why do we teach them anything? They'd kill us if they could." Silence swept the room. Major Vance stepped forward. His voice was low, steady. They lost, we won. That means we choose what comes next, McLean glared at him. And what comes next? Forgiveness? Vance didn't answer. But the look in his eyes was enough. War was ending. A new world was beginning. Someone had to build it, even if the bricks were words instead of bullets. The next morning, disaster shattered the fragile progress. A group of Japanese POWs working in the kitchen seized a chance to escape. They attacked a guard with a stolen knife and fled into the jungle. Alarm screamed. Searchlights pierced the canopy. Marines stormed through vines and shadows. Hours later, they returned carrying bodies wrapped in soaked canvas. When Sergeant Ito announced the deaths, the women reacted with horror, not at the escape attempt, but at the failure. Dying with honor had always been preferable to living in defeat. But something was different now. For the first time, death looked pointless. Ito saw their faces change and his voice softened. Your war is over, he said. You cannot change the past, but you can choose what you become next. A whisper moved through the room. What if we do not know who we are without the Emperor? No one answered. That afternoon, the Americans introduced something new. Something far more humiliating than books. A debate. A real debate. Prisoners divided into two groups, each required to argue a position. Not with fists, not with insults, but with words. The topic: should citizens have the right to question their leaders? When Ito announced it, half the room erupted. Sakura stood face burning red. You are forcing us to betray Japan. Ito shook his head. A debate is not betrayal. It is thinking. But to women raised under a godlike emperor, thinking itself could be treason. The debate began with trembling voices. Sakura argued with ferocity. The emperor was divine, unquestionable, the soul of the nation. Others echoed her. But for every argument, Ito pressed them. If leaders cannot be questioned, who protects the people? The room grew louder, angrier. Tears streamed down faces. Not because they hated democracy, but because they feared their beliefs might be wrong. When the debate ended, the room was silent. The women stared at one another, breathing hard, hearts pounding. They had survived hunger, disease, artillery fire, but nothing had wounded them like ideas. That night, rain poured again. The barracks shook. Water leaked through the tin roof. Women huddled under blankets, too tired to speak. Except Yumi. She crept once more to the bookshelf. But this time she wasn't alone. One by one, other women stood. Sakura among them. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. They simply read. Pages turned softly in the storm like a secret ceremony. Outside, the American guards patrolled in silence. None interrupted. None mocked. They knew what was happening inside that hut was more important than guns or fences. It was transformation. Slow. Painful. Unseen by the world beyond the jungle. But in a prison camp on a forgotten corner of Luzon, the war was not ending with bullets, it was ending with thought. The monsoon season thickened, turning pathways into rivers of mud and filling the air with the heavy smell of rot and tropical earth. Weeks had passed since the first pamphlets were handed out, and the camp, once silent, hostile, crackling with tension, now carried a strange, uneasy calm. Not peace, not acceptance, something more fragile, like cloth stretched tight before it tears. Every day, democracy lessons continued. Every night, whispered arguments rippled through the barracks. The Japanese women were no longer united by simple hatred. They were divided by questions they had never been allowed to think. But the war outside was not done. Before dawn, a thunderous blast shook the camp. Dust fell from the rafters. Guards sprinted toward the south wall, rifles raised. The prisoners rushed to the windows, hearts pounding. Through the morning fog, they saw the silhouette of a single aircraft spiraling downward, smoke trailing like a broken ribbon, a Japanese bomber, crippled, dying. It struck a rice field beyond the tree line, flames rising in a plume of black smoke. American patrols mounted trucks and raced toward the wreck, not knowing whether survivors were armed or whether the plane carried only death and fuel. Moments later, stretcher bearers returned. On one litter lay an American soldier, shrapnel embedded in his chest. On the other lay two Japanese women, aircrew auxiliaries, Burned, unconscious, their uniforms scorched to ash and cloth. When Sakura saw them, something broke in her expression. She rushed forward, only to be held back by guards until order was restored. Major Vance stepped forward, calm, composed, and spoke only 2 words. "Bring them in." The prisoners watched with disbelief as American medics carried the wounded Japanese women into the infirmary. Clean sheets, sterile bandages, morphine, IV fluid, treatment that soldiers rarely received in the field. Sakura pressed her palms to the rusted fence, voice trembling. "They would not do this for you," she whispered. Ito heard her. He did not turn. He simply said, "That is the difference." Inside the infirmary, the wounded aircrew moaned in their fevered sleep. Their hair was burned, skin blistered, breath shallow. The American doctors worked through the morning, sweat dripping down their faces in the choking heat. The Japanese prisoners watched through the doorway, breath held tight in their chests. War had taught them that mercy was weakness. But here, mercy was stronger than steel. That night, a guard brought a tray of food to the infirmary. One of the patients woke just long enough to whisper, "Why?" The guard, a farm boy from Kansas who had never left his hometown before the war, answered in a voice barely louder than the flicker of the lantern, "Because you're human." The next morning, Sakura stepped into the classroom without being ordered. Her shadow fell dark across the bamboo floor. She picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a single character on the board, Ren, person. Then she sat down. No one spoke, but the room pulsed with meaning. For the first time, she had admitted the enemy was not a monster, but a human being. Yet transformation is never so simple. For every heart softened, another hardened like stone. One prisoner, Sergeant Akiko Morita, a former combat auxiliary, refused to attend lessons. She ate in silence, slept near the door, and kept her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the wire. Rumor said she had killed a wounded Marine with her last bullet before surrender. Rumor said she wanted to die. When the Americans introduced a new lesson, freedom of the press, Akiko did not come to class. Instead, she stood in the center of the yard and shouted so that every prisoner and every guard could hear, "You shame us all. You sit and listen like children while the enemy poisons your minds. We should die before learning their words." Some of the prisoners lowered their heads in guilt. Others turned away. But Yumi stepped forward. "No," she said softly. "We should live before forgetting our own." Akiko slapped her across the face so hard she fell into the mud. Gasps echoed across the yard. A guard reached for his rifle, but Yumi shook her head. She stood, wiped the blood from her lip, and bowed. "We are not children," Yumi whispered. "We can listen and still remain Japanese." Akiko stared at her, stunned. Because she had not struck weakness, she had struck strength. That night, while the women slept, Akiko sat alone at the edge of her mat. She hadn't prayed since surrender. Now she whispered to a god she wasn't sure was listening. "Show me what is honor." The next day she attended class. Not to learn. To watch, not to bow. To judge. But even judgment requires thought. And thought is the seed of change. As weeks passed, the Americans began showing the POWs newspapers, fresh from Manila. Headlines announced battles, surrenders. The empire shrinking like a dying animal. Prisoners read every word, hands shaking. The truth, once unthinkable, was now printed in ink. Japan could not win. One afternoon, Sergeant Ito placed a radio in the classroom. The women sat in rigid lines, eyes wide, breath held, waiting. The signal crackled, a distant voice speaking Japanese. A broadcast from Tokyo. A statement from Emperor Hirohito himself. He did not speak of victory. He spoke of endurance, survival, the future. The room felt suddenly weightless, as if gravity had slipped. Sakura's voice trembled. He does not say we will triumph." "No," Ito whispered. "He does not." The broadcast ended. Silence fell like a stone. For the first time, even the most loyal felt the ground shift beneath them. The emperor had not demanded death. He had spoken of rebuilding. The meaning was clear, though no one dared voice it. Japan was preparing to surrender. That night, storms pounded the roofs, lightning splitting the sky. The women lay awake, staring at darkness. If surrender came, what would they be? Soldiers without a nation, warriors without a war, women without honor, and yet alive. The next morning, something truly unexpected happened. The Americans held a mock election. Such a thing would have been laughable once. Now it felt like a blow to the chest. They set out a wooden box with a slit, paper slips, pencils, a chalkboard with 2 names, American political figures the women had never heard of, candidates chosen only to demonstrate the process. Each prisoner was called forward to cast a vote. Sakura refused. Akiko refused. Nearly half refused, but others, quietly, trembling, stepped forward. Yumi was the first. She folded her slip, slid it into the box, and stepped away, face pale but eyes proud. One by one, more followed. Voting meant nothing and everything. It was a ceremony of choice. When Sakura's name was called, she shook her head. Her hands trembled. The box waited. The camp watched. Finally, she stepped forward. She took the pencil, stared at the paper, and whispered, "I am still Japanese." She marked a name anyway, not because she believed in it, but because she wanted to understand. When the last ballot was cast, Sergeant Ito counted the slips aloud. The women leaned forward, breathless with a strange, almost childlike excitement. When a winner was announced, cheers erupted, not for the candidate, but for the realization they had chosen something for the first time in their lives. It was a small freedom. But freedom never starts big. Afterward, Sakura approached Yumi outside the classroom. The air was thick with humidity, cicadas buzzing like static in the trees. "You are stronger than I thought," Sakura said. Yumi smiled. "I am learning." "Learning what?" "That we can be more than what we were told." Sakura looked away, tears forming, because she had begun to believe it too. But not everyone was ready. 2 nights later, an American sentry spotted movement near the inner gate. Flashlight beams cut across the yard. 3 prisoners knelt in the mud, digging with spoons fashioned into shovels. Attempted escape. Guards surrounded them, rifles drawn. Prisoners inside the barracks woke to shouting. Sakura rushed to the fence, heart pounding. Yumi followed, breathless. The guards hauled the women to their feet. They were terrified, faces streaked with tears and dirt. One cried out in Japanese, "We do not want to forget Japan. We do not want to lose ourselves." The Americans didn't strike them, didn't chain them. Instead, Major Vance stepped forward, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. "You are not prisoners of American ideas," he said softly. "You are prisoners of this war. When the war ends, you will return home, but you must survive to do that." The women collapsed to their knees, not from fear, relief. For the first time, they believed they had a future. Inside the barracks, a new silence spread. Not hostile, not resigned, reflective. The women sat awake beneath dim lanterns, their faces lit by soft golden light. Some read books, others stared into space. A few quietly cried, not from pain, but from the terrifying possibility that life might continue after surrender, that they might return to Japan, changed, but alive. And that was the cruelest truth democracy taught them. You did not need to die for honor, you could live for it. The jungle heat lifted slowly, replaced by a thin, brittle coolness that hinted at the approaching dry season. The rain stopped, the mud hardened, and the camp changed again, almost invisibly, like a wound healing under bandages. Guards no longer carried rifles at all hours. Prisoners were allowed into the central courtyard without escorts. The women, once silent and rigid with hatred, now greeted their captors with cautious nods. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but recognition of humanity. For weeks, the democracy, classes continued, laws, rights, elections, civic duty. Words that once sounded like insults now settled like seeds in soil. Some would grow, some would die, but the ground was different than it had been before. One morning, as the sun climbed through mist and palm fronds, Major Vance assembled the camp in the courtyard. His voice carried across the square, steady and clear. "Today there will be something new." A long table was set beneath a white canvas awning. On it sat bowls, fruit, vegetables, knives wrapped in cloth, and ingredients that smelled like unfamiliar spices. The prisoners stared, baffled and wary. Cooking supplies, food preparation. What did this mean? Then the true humiliation became clear. The Americans wanted them to cook, not as slaves, not as servants, but as participants. A cultural exchange. Vance spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. Tonight there will be a meal shared by guards and prisoners. You will cook Japanese dishes. We will cook American dishes. You will eat with us. A ripple of shock passed through the ranks. To share a table with the enemy was unthinkable. Eating together, laughing, speaking, living felt more dangerous than any battlefield. Sakura stepped forward, voice sharp with disbelief. You want us to pretend the war never happened? Vance shook his head. We want to prove it can end. Silence. Until Private Yumi Takahashi, the girl who loved books, spoke softly. I will cook. Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. Slowly, hesitantly, others joined her. Even Akiko Morita, the warrior who had sworn never to bow. One by one, they stepped to the table and picked up knives, spoons, rice bowls. Some shook with rage, others with fear. Pride was a brittle thing, but it bent now, where once it would have shattered. All afternoon, the courtyard filled with sound. Pots clanging, water boiling, voices rising and falling in Japanese and English. American cooks stepped forward, showing how to knead dough for bread, how to season pork, how to slice onions without losing fingers. Japanese prisoners worked beside them, not as captives, but as equals in the artistry of feeding human beings. The air filled with aromas the camp had forgotten. Soy sauce sizzling in a pan, rice steaming, chicken grilling over charcoal, strange spices carried on the wind. Women who had once scowled at every American word now exchanged recipes with them. Yumi showed a corporal how to prepare onigiri, shaping rice balls with salt and seaweed. He showed her how to make cornbread. Their laughter was quiet, almost shy. Sakura prepared miso soup, her movements precise despite her shaking hands. When she accidentally spilled broth, an American medic bent to help. She flinched at first but did not pull away. Only Akiko worked in silence, chopping vegetables with fast, furious strokes. No one spoke to her. No one expected her to smile. But she didn't walk away. And that was enough. When night came, lanterns lit the courtyard with a warm yellow glow. Prisoners and guards sat at crude wooden tables facing one another with stiff, nervous posture. The jungle hummed beyond the wire. Fireflies drifted in and out of shadow. Then, for the first time since the war began, Japanese soldiers and American soldiers shared a meal. No speeches, no toasts, just food. And the quiet shock of discovering that the enemy bled the same color, laughed the same way, chewed and swallowed and breathed, just like any human being. Sergeant Harold McLean, whose brother had died on Saipan, sat alone for a long time. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight. When a Japanese nurse placed a bowl of rice and chicken before him, he stared at it as if it were poison. Nurse Sakura spoke, voice soft. It is not a weapon, only food. His eyes burned with grief, rage, confusion. But slowly he lifted the spoon. He ate. And somewhere deep in his chest, the burning eased. Across the table, Yumi ate American cornbread for the first time. Her eyes widened. It was sweet, strange, soft as cloud. She whispered, "This tastes happy." An American cook laughed. "It's from my mother's recipe." Yumi blinked hard, swallowing more than food. Later that night, when the meal was finished and the lanterns flickered low, the camp sat in silence. No guards, no prisoners, just exhausted souls caught in a moment where war loosened its grip. Then, unexpectedly, it happened. One of the Japanese clerks began to hum, a folk song, a lullaby from Hokkaido. Her voice was weak at first, barely more than breath, but others joined. Soft, trembling harmony filling the night air. When they finished, the courtyard was still. An American soldier stood. He cleared his throat, then began singing a Western hymn, Amazing Grace. His voice cracked halfway through. Another guard joined him, then another. Soon, two languages floated together across the camp, blending into something that did not belong to America or Japan, but to everyone trapped in the war's shadow. Sakura, who had once sworn to hate until her final breath, bowed her head and cried openly. She was not alone. After the meal, the prisoners returned to their barracks with full stomachs and hearts heavy with something they couldn't name. One woman whispered, "If we survive, how do we go home like this?" Because they knew the truth. Learning democracy was no longer humiliation. It was transformation. And transformation meant they could never be the same soldiers again. But war was not done shaping them. 2 days later, a patrol returned with 3 new prisoners. Japanese women captured in the mountains, emaciated, fevered, close to death. They had been hiding with the last pockets of resistance. Their bodies were starving, their eyes wild. When they entered the camp, they saw Japanese POWs sitting calmly in the courtyard, reading books, speaking to guards, studying lessons. Fury erupted from their lips. "Traitors!" they screamed. "Dogs of America!" Shame on you. Shame on Japan. They refused food, refused bandages, refused water touched by American hands. They spat on the ground and demanded to be shot rather than re-educated. Akiko stepped forward, eyes narrow. Enough. The newcomers glared at her, eager for violence, but Akiko did not strike. Instead, she walked to the bookshelf in the barrack and picked up the same tattered pamphlet she once vowed never to read. She placed it in their hands. "You don't have to believe," Akiko whispered. "Just know that you are not animals in a cage. They don't treat us like that. They treat us like people." The new prisoners stared, trembling. Their hatred cracked. A breath escaped that sounded almost like relief. Later that night, they drank water from American cups. The next morning, they ate rice. By evening, one of them sat in the back of the classroom, silent but listening. The transformation no longer belonged to Yumi or Sakura or Akiko alone. It was spreading, slow as dawn, unstoppable as truth. And then, the world changed. One sweltering afternoon, an American jeep tore into the compound, dust rising behind its wheels. A radio operator leaped from the passenger seat, sprinted to Major Vance, and thrust a slip of paper into his hand. Vance read it. His eyes widened. He called Sergeant Ito. Together, they crossed the yard toward the barracks. The Japanese women stood as they entered, sensing something strange, electric in the air. Ito spoke, voice shaking. A message from Tokyo. An announcement from the Emperor. The women leaned forward, breath frozen. Ito swallowed hard. "Hiroshima has been destroyed." Gasps. Hands flew to mouths. Bodies collapsed to the floor. Some screamed. Some prayed. Others stared at the dirt, unable to breathe. The war had taken everything, but this was the unthinkable. The Emperor's voice came over the radio, trembling, broken, stripped of divine authority. He spoke of a new and cruel bomb, of unbearable damage, of enduring the unendurable. For the first time in Japanese history, the Emperor told his people to lay down their arms. There was no victory left, only surrender. The women in the camp fell to their knees. Some sobbed until they were empty. Others sat motionless, staring into a future they could not imagine. The beliefs that had been stitched into their souls since childhood, honor, death before surrender, loyalty unto oblivion, had been shattered by a single voice on a radio. Yumi whispered through tears, "We are alive, and Japan is not." No one corrected her, because it felt true. Night came, heavy and silent. The barracks were filled with quiet weeping. Guards did not interfere. They stood in the darkness, listening, understanding that history itself was unfolding inside wooden walls. The next morning, the sun rose like it always had, warm, bright, indifferent to human grief. The women stepped out into the courtyard, eyes swollen, spirits fragile. Sergeant Ito stood waiting. He bowed to them, not as victor to defeated enemy, as one Japanese soul to another. And for the first time they bowed back, not because they were prisoners, because they were people. The camp awoke the next morning under a silence that felt heavier than artillery. Even the jungle seemed muted. No monkeys screaming in distant branches, no macaws cutting across the sky. It was as if the world itself held its breath. The Japanese women stood at roll call, not with military posture, but with the hollow stillness of people who had witnessed the death of an idea. They were no longer captives of America. They were captives of history. Sergeant Ito read the official message again at noon, this time slowly, each word sinking like a stone into the prisoners' hearts. The Empire of Japan has accepted terms of surrender. Some women collapsed where they stood. Others stared blankly at the ground. A few, trembling with grief, begged the guards to shoot them, to spare them the humiliation of living through defeat. But the Americans refused. There would be no more death here. Later that afternoon, Major Vance gathered the camp in the courtyard. He stood before them with a document in his hand and a look on his face that none of them had seen before. Not sternness, not suspicion, not command. Something gentler. "This war is over," he said. "You will not be prisoners much longer." The words shook the camp as violently as any bomb. The Japanese women looked at him in disbelief, as if liberation were a trick, a cruel joke, a lie to soften their surrender. But it wasn't. They were going home. For the rest of the day, preparations began. Paperwork, medical checks, supplies. Each woman was issued a clean uniform with no rank, no insignia, just cloth and buttons. A uniform meant not to separate them from America, but to free them from war. They folded their old uniforms with trembling hands. Some kissed the imperial patch before placing it gently in crates. These uniforms had been their armor, their proof of loyalty, their last shield of identity. To remove them felt like removing skin. Yumi cried as she buttoned her new jacket. Sakura helped her. Even Akiko did not turn away. That evening, Major Vance visited the barracks. He paused at the doorway, unsure whether to enter. It was the first time he looked like a man uncertain of his place. The women stood and bowed, not deeply, not militarily, but with respect. "We will begin transport in 2 days," Vance said. "You will go first to Manila. After that, home when the ships are ready." One woman whispered, "If home is still there." He did not lie. "I don't know." No one expected him to. When Vance stepped outside, the prisoners followed to watch the sunset. The sky was streaked with red and gold, clouds glowing like embers. For weeks they had stared only at books, fences, and faces. Now for the first time they noticed a horizon again. Yumi said quietly, "I forgot the world was beautiful." Sakura answered, "We were too busy dying to see it." As darkness fell, lanterns glowed across the yard. But the camp stayed awake. No lessons, no drills, no guards shouting orders. Just the uneasy quiet of people who had survived the end of everything they believed in. The next morning brought a ritual no one expected. The Americans gave the women paper and pencils. At first, they did not understand. Then Ito explained, "You may write letters. To your families. To anyone still living." Pen on paper, it was the simplest gesture, but it felt like resurrection. Many had assumed their families were dead. Others feared they would be hated for surrender. But the chance to write, to speak, to reach beyond the barbed wire, was a mercy greater than any lesson in democracy. Sakura wrote first. Her hand shook so badly she had to press the paper against her knee to keep it steady. "Mother, if you live, know this. I did not die for the Emperor. I lived for you." Yumi wrote to her younger sister. Akiko wrote to a child she had never seen, born while she was stationed in Manchuria. Others wrote to husbands, parents, lovers, friends. Some wrote long letters. Others wrote only a single sentence, "I am alive." The next day, an American mail truck carried the letters away. The prisoners watched it disappear down the road, a small dust cloud trailing behind, hope vanishing into the jungle. That night, something extraordinary happened. Sergeant Harold McLean, the Marine who had hated them with every cell of his body, walked slowly to the barracks. The women stiffened. His shadow moved across the floor like a blade. He cleared his throat. "I won't pretend I ever forgave," he said, "but you did something my brother never got the chance to do. You lived." He reached into his pocket and handed Yumi a small object, a silver locket, dented and dirty. He took it from a Japanese soldier on Saipan, souvenir of hate. Yumi stared, horrified, but McLean shook his head. "I'm done hating," he placed the locket in her hand and walked away. Yumi clutched it to her chest and cried more freely than she ever had in her life. The following morning, American trucks rumbled into camp. Supplies were loaded, bags stacked, records stamped. The gate, once a symbol of imprisonment, swung wide, but the women hesitated. Freedom was terrifying. Beyond the gate was a world they no longer recognized. Japan would not be the same Japan they left. Their families might be gone, their homes destroyed, their emperor human, their beliefs broken. Leaving the camp meant facing a future without the armor of obedience. Akiko stepped forward first. She turned to Major Vance and bowed deeply. "You treated us like humans," she said, "so we will try to live like humans." Vance bowed back, lower than anyone expected. "If you return to Japan, remember this. The world is wide. Wider than war. Wider than flags." One by one, the prisoners boarded the trucks. Yumi turned and waved to the guards, her eyes bright with something new: gratitude, courage, and the terrifying joy of being alive. The trucks rolled out. The gate swung closed behind them. The camp grew quiet. Hours later, the trucks reached a Red Cross processing center near Manila. Women stepped down, blinking at crowds of civilians, medics, nurses, soldiers. Some were Japanese, others American, Filipino, British. War had scattered lives across nations. But here, under white tents and Red Cross flags, those lives began stitching themselves back together. The Japanese women surrendered their prisoner tags, their medical records, their ration books. They were no longer POWs. They were simply women. In the days that followed, something miraculous happened. Letters returned. Yumi received word. Her sister was alive. Sakura learned her parents had survived the bombings. Akiko discovered her child still lived in Kyoto. Some women had no replies, only silence, but even silence was better than graves. It meant there was still hope. Meanwhile, the Americans processed paperwork to send them back across the sea. But voyages took time. Ships were full of wounded refugees and soldiers going home. So the Japanese women waited in Manila, unguarded, unchained, sleeping in tents instead of cages. And something extraordinary happened. They helped. They cleaned hospital floors, helped cook food, read stories to orphaned children, sewed bandages, translated, laughed, lived. Yumi taught Filipino children how to fold paper cranes. Sakura helped an American nurse deliver a baby. Akiko learned to write her name in English. The democracy lessons, they never spoke of them again. They didn't need to. The lessons lived in their actions. When the ship finally arrived, a gray transport vessel with peeling paint and salt-stained rails, the women walked up the gangway one last time. None looked back. They did not need to. They carried the camp inside them now. As the ship's horn blasted and Manila drifted away, Yumi stood at the railing. The ocean was endless and blue, the horizon stretching like a promise. She whispered, "We survived the empire. Now we will survive peace." Sakura stood beside her. Akiko too. They did not speak. They didn't have to. They were going home, not as defeated prisoners, but as women who had touched a truth larger than war. That dignity was not given by emperors or armies. It was earned by living, and somewhere across that vast ocean, Japan waited, broken, grieving, but alive like them. The ship's engines hummed. The camp on Luzon faded into memory, and the war, so loud, so brutal, so absolute, finally let them go. They were free.